The courtroom was cloaked in a heavy silence, the kind that seeps into your bones and makes the air feel too thick to breathe. Every creak of a wooden bench, every rustle of papers, echoed through the grand chamber like thunder. A storm of judgment was gathering. At the center of it all sat David Miller, an 18-year-old who looked like he'd stumbled into the wrong place at the wrong time. His suit didn't fit, too loose in the shoulders, the sleeves brushing awkwardly past his wrists, a silent testament to how ill-prepared the world believed he was. But what no one in the room could see was the fire quietly building behind his eyes. Judge Carolyn Harrow, a woman known for her uncompromising demeanor and sharp intellect, peered at David over the rim of her glasses. Her expression was that of mild amusement tinged with disdain, a look often reserved for those who dared to challenge the rules without the armor of experience. Her voice, when it came, was low and deliberate, each word carrying the weight of institutional authority. "Mr. David Miller," she began, her tone laced with irony, "you've chosen to represent yourself in this matter, grand theft auto and resisting arrest. Are you quite certain you don't want a real attorney? This isn't a debate club, young man. This is the law." A ripple of laughter escaped from the gallery behind him, cruel and dismissive. Even the prosecutor, a polished man named Grayson with years of courtroom victories under his belt, allowed himself a smirk. To them, David was just another misguided teenager, an overconfident boy trying to play a man's game. But David stood slowly, the tremble in his fingers betraying the storm of anxiety twisting inside him. He had rehearsed this moment in his mind 1,000 times, had imagined what it would feel like to speak, not just to defend, but to assert. His voice, when it broke the silence, was calm but filled with a fragile intensity that demanded attention. "Your Honor, I understand the gravity of the charges against me. I've spent weeks reviewing every piece of evidence, every testimony, every legal precedent relevant to this case. I'm not here because I believe this is easy. I'm here because I believe I can prove my innocence. I have no one else to speak for me, so I'll speak for myself." Judge Harrow's eyebrows rose slightly, the faintest flicker of curiosity dancing across her otherwise unreadable face. She said nothing, only gestured for the prosecutor to begin. The show, it seemed, would go on. As the prosecutor launched into his opening statement, confidently outlining a seemingly airtight case, David's mind was in overdrive. His heart pounded in his chest like a drum of war, but his hands steadied, his breath slowed. He was scared. How could he not be? But beneath that fear was a deeper resolve, one forged not from arrogance, but from desperation and purpose. They had already decided what kind of person he was. They looked at his youth, his posture, his second-hand suit, and saw guilt. But David had not come to plead for mercy. He had come to show them what they refused to see. And as the words of the prosecutor filled the room, painting David as just another reckless delinquent, David sat silent, unmoving, absorbing every word, not as a victim, but as a strategist. The air still felt thick. The judgment still loomed. But in that courtroom, surrounded by cynicism and doubt, David held tight to one unshakable truth. He was not the story they had written about him, and he would prove it line by line. When the prosecutor finally stepped back, his voice curling with the self-assurance of a man convinced he'd already won, a hush fell over the room once more. The judge gave David a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was time, and David, still seated, allowed himself one last breath, deep, slow, as though drawing strength from something buried far deeper than textbooks or case files. Then he stood. At first he said nothing. He walked slowly toward the center of the room, eyes lowered, not in submission but in concentration. The silence stretched, became uncomfortable. Some shifted in their seats. Grayson frowned. Judge Harrow leaned back slightly, intrigued. Then David lifted his gaze, and when he finally spoke, his voice came not with the fiery force of a crusader, but with the chilling precision of someone who had been forced to sharpen every word into a blade. "You said I ran from the scene because I was guilty," he began, his tone even, his hands at his sides. "But what you never asked was why I ran. You presented it like instinct, as if fear is an admission of guilt. But fear can be a response to survival. And he paused, swallowing the knot forming in his throat. I've spent most of my life running. Not from guilt, but from being misunderstood. He walked to the evidence board the prosecutor had used earlier. Photos, documents, surveillance stills, each one laid out to tell a story in which David was the villain. He pointed to an image of a car screeching through a street, a blur of motion in the dark. That's me, apparently. That car was reported stolen at 9:07 p.m. But what your timeline fails to mention is that at exactly 9:07, I was on a call with a friend. The call log is here. He pulled a document from his folder and handed it to the clerk. That call lasted 10 minutes. I couldn't have been at both places. Grayson opened his mouth to interrupt, but David didn't stop. You claimed I was seen fleeing the scene. But the witness who said that, Mr. Randall, he described someone wearing a red hoodie. I was wearing this. He held up the worn blue jacket he'd brought with him, one with a tear in the sleeve and paint stains near the hem. That might seem insignificant to you, but to someone like me, details matter. Because people like me don't get the benefit of the doubt. His words began to tremble now, not from uncertainty, but from the weight of being heard. Finally, you talked about motive. You called me reckless, angry, unstable. You painted me as someone looking for trouble. But you never asked what I was actually doing that night. I wasn't running wild through the city. I was on my way to see my sister. She had just been admitted to the hospital for an overdose. I didn't know if she would make it. And in the middle of that chaos, when the cops pulled me aside because I looked suspicious, I panicked. He turned slowly, looking at the jury, locking eyes with one of the older men in the front row. I know how it looked. I know how it sounds. But you weren't there when they shouted at me to get on the ground. You weren't there when the officer's hand hovered near his holster, eyes wild like I was already guilty. You weren't there when I realized that one wrong move could cost me everything. The room had changed. What began as a cold tribunal had shifted into something far more intimate, far more human. David's voice was no longer that of a boy defending himself. It was the voice of someone tearing down the mask the world had forced him to wear. I'm not here to deny that mistakes were made. But the story you're hearing isn't the truth. It's a version of the truth that fits neatly into your assumptions. I'm not asking you to feel sorry for me. I'm asking you to see me. Not the headlines. Not the file. Me. He stopped speaking, his breath ragged, chest rising and falling like a runner who had just crossed a finish line he was never supposed to reach. The room was silent again, but this time it was a different kind of silence. Not heavy with judgment, but charged with something else, uncertainty, maybe even the first flicker of doubt. And as David returned to his seat, the judge leaned forward slightly, her eyes unreadable, but narrowed now with thought. Grayson glanced at his notes, no longer smirking. Something had shifted. David had not just defended himself. He had changed the air in the room. He had made them listen. The silence that lingered after David's impassioned testimony was like the hush before a storm, not a calm, but a pause, thick with electricity. Judge Harrow finally broke it with a subtle gesture, permitting David to continue. He stood again, slower this time, as if the weight of the story he was about to tell required steadier footing. There's something else you need to know, David said, his voice quieter now, not out of weakness, but because the truth, when it cuts deep enough, doesn't need to shout. He walked back to the evidence board and pointed again to the grainy photo of the car, the so-called stolen vehicle that had been central to the prosecution's narrative. You've all seen this. You've been told that this car was reported stolen, and that I was the one who took it. But that report? It was filed by a man named Kenneth Avery. A man who's never once been asked why he waited 2 hours to call the police. He turned to face the court again. His eyes didn't scan the room for sympathy. They locked in, steady, like a diver about to plunge into dark waters. Kenneth Avery isn't just a bystander. He's my mother's former landlord. And 2 months before that night, he threatened to evict her after I confronted him about a series of illegal charges he was piling onto her rent. Charges I found, documented, and filed a complaint about. He lost money. He lost leverage. And he knew who I was. A murmur rippled through the gallery. David pressed forward. He didn't report the car stolen because it was stolen. He reported it stolen because he knew it would put me in the crosshairs. He saw me on the street that night. He even shouted at me. I didn't respond. I didn't even look back. But he remembered my face. And when the incident happened just blocks from where he lived, he saw a chance to settle a score. He reached into his folder again and pulled out a thin, stapled packet. This is a copy of the original rental agreement between Avery and my mother. And here, he flipped to a page and held it up for the judge, are the emails I sent to the housing authority, including photographs of the illegal repairs he charged for. That report was filed on October 3rd. On October 6th, the so-called theft took place. That timing is not a coincidence. It's a warning shot. David's tone deepened now, rougher around the edges, like gravel underfoot. No one asked why a man would wait 2 hours to report a crime in progress. No one checked his history with our family. You were all so quick to believe I was the thief because it fit the narrative. The angry kid, the troubled past, the wrong place at the wrong time. But no one stopped to ask if I was placed there. He stepped closer to the jury box, but not too close, just enough that his presence felt real, undeniable. You keep looking at this car like it's the centerpiece of the case. But it's just a distraction. It's a tool. A lie built on convenience and silence. Then, for the first time, David's voice cracked, not from uncertainty, but from memory. Do you know what it feels like to be turned into a symbol? To walk into a courtroom and see your whole life boiled down to a police report and a mugshot? To be talked about like a threat before you're even allowed to speak? That car didn't just take me to the edge of this case. It dragged every part of my life with it. My mother, my sister, the little piece we had left. He looked down for a moment, and when he looked back up, the fight in his eyes had changed. It wasn't desperation anymore. It was resolve. You were told I stole something that night. But what really happened is someone tried to steal me. My name. My story. My future. The courtroom was still. Even the judge's gavel sat untouched, as though the very room had surrendered to the gravity of his words. David let the silence hang this time. Not to fill it, but to let the truth settle. And in that stillness, what was once a grainy photo became something else entirely. Not evidence, but proof of how easily truth can be twisted, how easily a life can be reduced to a shadow if no one dares to see the light behind it. David stood motionless for a moment longer, facing the jury, his breathing steady but deep, as if he had just climbed out of something dark and suffocating. Then, without needing to ask permission, he turned back toward the projector where the prosecution's most damning evidence had lingered all trial, the grainy surveillance footage. The image had been shown again and again, a lone figure in a hoodie walking near the scene, a few minutes before the alleged theft. It was blurry, dark, more shadow than substance. But it had been enough to build a case. Enough, the prosecution claimed, to tie that shadow to David. He approached the screen with slow, deliberate steps, and when he spoke, his voice was low, almost conversational, but laced with the rawness of someone exposing a long-buried wound. This, he said, gesturing toward the figure frozen mid-step in the frame, is what they say proves everything. That this is me. That this image, this moment, captured in pixels that could belong to anyone, is the key to my guilt. But let me ask you something. He turned toward the jury again, eyes locked, voice beginning to harden. Can you see my face in that footage? Can you see my skin, my eyes, my walk? Or did they tell you who it was, and you believed them, because it could be me? He didn't wait for an answer. Instead, he reached into his folder one last time and pulled out a photograph, a still image from that same surveillance camera but taken 20 minutes after the alleged theft. This, he said, holding it up high, is the frame they never showed you. He placed it beside the incriminating still. The courtroom leaned forward collectively as the second image came into view. Another figure, similarly dressed, walking the opposite direction, same camera, same angle, but this time, the timestamp showed a different story. This person, David continued, his voice steady now, like a tide that refused to recede, was caught on camera after the theft was supposed to have occurred. Same height, same clothes, same walk. But I was already at home by then. I was logged in to a school computer. I was messaging my sister. I was writing an essay that's time-stamped and stored on my school server. That was proven. But this second frame was never entered into evidence.
Why?
Because it didn't fit the narrative. His voice rose now, not in anger, but with the ferocity of clarity long denied. They saw what they wanted to see. They made a blurry silhouette into a guilty man. But this second image proves there was someone else. Someone who dressed like me, moved like me, but wasn't me. He stepped closer to the jury, his tone softening again, full of the ache of having to explain something that should have been obvious all along. You're not just looking at video. You're looking at what happens when a system decides it knows who you are before you even speak. When a blurry photo becomes more powerful than a truth. He paused and took a long breath. I am not that shadow. I am not that silence. I am not your fear, or your suspicion, or your shortcut to closure. I am a student, a son, a brother. I was at home that night, working to build a life bigger than the one people like Kenneth Avery tried to confine me to. And all this time, I've waited for someone to actually look at the full picture. David turned, his final words carrying not just emotion but weight, like bricks laid carefully in a foundation. So now I ask you, do you see a criminal, or do you see a young man fighting to be seen clearly for the first time? He stepped away from the screen, leaving the two images side by side, blur against blur, truth against assumption. And in the breathless hush that followed, the courtroom finally began to see not a verdict, but a question they'd never truly asked. What if we were wrong? David stood again, his posture quieter this time, not as defiant, not as fiery, but stripped bare, vulnerable in a way that seemed to hush the room without command. He looked out not just at the jury now, but at everyone, prosecution, judge, audience, as if asking them to see something they had all missed. Not a fact, not a piece of evidence, but a feeling, a human truth. I want to talk about the moment I ran. His voice was soft. Too soft for the weight of that sentence. And yet it trembled with something deeper. Grief, perhaps, or the worn exhaustion of having to explain over and over something that should have never required explaining. You say I ran because I had something to hide. That innocent people don't run. That if I were telling the truth, I would have stood still, spoken calmly, cooperated like the storybooks say we're supposed to. But that's not how it works where I'm from. That's not how it feels when the lights are too bright and the sirens too loud and the air itself becomes a cage. He closed his eyes for a moment, searching for the right words, not as a lawyer, but as someone trying to make his soul legible. I didn't run from guilt. I ran to survive. Because I've seen what happens when people like me don't move fast enough. When they hesitate. When they ask questions. When they try to explain. I've seen people laid flat in the street for less. For walking. For reaching. For fitting a description. He opened his eyes again, and now there was heat, but it burned inward, a contained fire behind the eyes of someone who had spent a lifetime trying to stay cool in a world quick to ignite. You want to know what I felt? I'll tell you. I felt fear. Not the kind that makes your heart skip, but the kind that makes it sprint. The kind that lives in your bones. The kind you inherit. The kind that teaches you from childhood that even if you are innocent, the world might not wait to find out. He looked over at the prosecutor now, not accusing, but as if offering something fragile and unwrapped. You say I ran because I was hiding. But maybe I ran because I've spent my whole life trying not to be hunted. Because in that moment, it didn't feel like the police were coming to ask questions. It felt like they were coming for me. And all I could hear was my mother's voice telling me, years ago, if it ever happens, baby, just come home. Don't argue. Don't resist. Just come home. The silence in the room was no longer neutral. It pulsed, held, acknowledged. David took a step forward, his voice lower now, trembling. Running doesn't make me guilty. It makes me human. It makes me afraid. It makes me like every kid who's ever seen a news headline and thought, that could have been me. Because it almost was. He turned once more to the jury, searching their eyes now not for sympathy, but for recognition. Don't confuse fear with guilt. Don't mistake survival for silence. I didn't run to escape justice. I ran because I didn't think justice would wait to hear me speak. And then, as if the words had finally bled every ounce of weight from his chest, David stood still again. Still but not silent. Calm but not surrendered. His truth no longer hidden behind the image of a fleeing figure, but spoken out loud, raw and whole. And maybe, just maybe, for the first time, understood. David rose slowly, as if the weight of the entire trial had settled onto his shoulders and now he carried it alone, not out of pride, but necessity. There was a certain silence that followed him as he approached the witness stand. It wasn't the procedural quiet that came from order in the court. It was something deeper, like the room itself was holding its breath. Because for the first time, David was not simply a defendant or a rebuttal. He was choosing to be something else entirely, the final witness to his own life. He took the oath with steady hands, but his eyes betrayed the storm within. There was no lawyer beside him now, no barrier to shield him from the gaze of those who had been judging his every breath. And yet, in this moment of absolute vulnerability, there was also something unshakably resolute in him. A stillness that felt less like surrender and more like revelation. I wasn't supposed to speak, he began, voice low but thick with emotion. Not like this. I was supposed to sit here, let the system speak for me. Let others narrate my story, some of them well-meaning, some of them not. But none of them me. He glanced across the room, his eyes catching the glint of the prosecutor's desk, the jury box, the shadowed edges of the judge's bench. I've heard people describe me like I was some kind of shadow moving through the night. A threat. A thief. A liar. I've listened to strangers draw conclusions based on snapshots of my life. Blurry pictures, edited footage, silences twisted into suspicion. His voice cracked then, but he didn't shy away. He let the emotion rise and carry his words, not bury them. But I need you to see the whole picture. Not the footage. Me. The boy who worked double shifts to keep his little sister in school. The man who stopped believing in luck a long time ago because luck doesn't come to people like me unless we make it ourselves. I wasn't running from the law that night. I was running from the fear that no matter what I said, it wouldn't matter. That I'd already been found guilty the moment they saw my face. He drew in a slow breath, like someone learning again how to inhale after holding their breath for too long. I know this isn't how these things usually go. I know the smart thing would have been to keep quiet, to let the lawyers do their job. But I can't stay silent anymore. Not when I know that every word I say now might be the last chance I have to be heard, not as a defendant, not as a symbol, but as a human being. David's gaze turned directly to the jury then, unflinching, not in challenge, but in quiet desperation. I didn't come here today to perform innocence. I came to be it, to live it, to show it. And if that means laying every wound I carry bare in front of you, I'll do it. Not because I want your pity, but because I want you to feel what it's like to be me, even just for a minute. To carry this fear, this hope, this relentless need to be seen as more than a mistake waiting to happen. There was a pause, long, aching, filled with the noise of breath and blinking eyes and the hearts of strangers trying to beat in time with his. I'm not perfect, he said softly, but I am not what they say I am. I am not this monster they've made of me. I am not a headline. I am not a mugshot. I am not broken. David sat back, not in defeat, but in finality. His testimony was not loud. It didn't need to be. Because in that courtroom, in that fragile silence that followed, something profound had shifted. For the first time, David was not just on trial. He was finally being heard. The courtroom was draped in a heavy stillness, as though time itself had been suspended in anticipation. No one moved. No one dared speak. Even the ticking of the clock seemed subdued, muffled by the gravity of what was to come. David sat with his hands folded tightly in his lap, the slightest tremble running through his fingers, not from fear anymore, but from the weight of having finally laid bare the truth, of having nothing more to give. He had become his own last line of defense, and now, the judgment no longer belonged to him. The judge's return was announced with a soft rustle of robes and the dull scrape of the chair behind the bench. The jury entered next, faces solemn, unreadable. 12 strangers who had just been handed a young man's future like it was a fragile, breakable thing, and in many ways it was. David did not look at them as they sat. He looked forward, not in defiance, but in faith. Faith not just in the justice he had asked for, but in the humanity he had tried to awaken. The clerk stood. The envelope was opened. And then the words came. On the count of felony theft, not guilty. On the count of resisting arrest, not guilty. On all counts, not guilty. There was a beat, a breathless, hollow beat, before the air itself seemed to exhale. Someone in the gallery stifled a cry. Another let out a whispered, "Thank God." But David remained still. Not stunned, not disbelieving, just still. Because sometimes, when you've carried the worst for so long, the sudden absence of pain feels foreign, almost frightening. He blinked slowly, once, twice, as though convincing himself this wasn't some last-minute dream conjured by a desperate heart. The judge's voice followed, firm yet laced with something quieter, something almost gentle. This court acknowledges the failure of perception, the danger of assumption, and the courage of the accused in speaking his truth when silence would have been easier. Mr. Reeves, you are free to go. The chains around his ankles and wrists had long since been removed, but in that moment, something else broke loose, something older, deeper. The invisible bonds of guilt not earned but inherited, the bruises of every stare that had called him guilty without a trial. As he stood, it was not just a man rising from his seat. It was a soul reclaiming its place in a world that had nearly cast it aside. Outside, the sky had broken open into a pale, golden hue. The steps of the courthouse were wet with the memory of morning rain, but sunlight was beginning to pour through the clouds in soft, defiant streaks. David emerged into that light not as a headline, not as a suspect, not as a cautionary tale, but as a survivor of truth. Every footstep felt both heavier and lighter than before, like he was learning to walk again without fear crouched at his side. A small crowd had gathered, mostly strangers, some with eyes wide not in judgment but in awe. And then, from somewhere among them, a single voice, clear, full of emotion, rose up. "Thank you for standing up." David turned toward the sound, and for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to smile. Not a smile of triumph, but of quiet endurance, of survival, of grace. Because he had not stood up to be thanked. He had stood up because no one else could tell his story. And in doing so, he had not only rewritten the narrative they tried to give him, he had reminded everyone watching that courage is not the absence of fear, but the insistence on speaking even when your voice shakes. That truth, when carried with enough conviction, can pierce even the thickest silence. And most of all, that even in a world that forgets your name, your dignity is yours to keep. Always. In the quiet that followed the storm, when the courtroom echoes had faded into memory and the public's fascination moved on like a restless tide, David stood alone, not in the shadow of what had been, but in the quiet light of what remained. He was no longer just a man who had been accused and then exonerated. He was something more difficult to define, more complex to carry, a living testament to the fine, fragile line between perception and truth. The world would forget the details. They always did. Names blur. Headlines fade. But somewhere in the margins, someone else, a boy walking home in the wrong neighborhood, a girl judged by the weight of her silence, a family clutching hope like a lifeline, would remember. Not the case. Not the verdict. But the story, the stand, the voice that refused to break. And it was for them that David spoke, quietly but firmly, one final time, not from a courtroom bench, not into a microphone, but into the vast, listening space where injustice always tries to hide. His words were not grand, not theatrical. They didn't need to be. They carried the intimacy of someone who had lived through fire and had learned how to name the heat. This wasn't just about me. It never was. It's about how quickly a life can be reduced to a file, how loud silence can feel when no one believes you, and how terrifying it is to see the truth and wonder if anyone else ever will. I wasn't brave every second. I wasn't sure every moment. But I didn't lie. I didn't give up. And sometimes that's the beginning of everything. He paused, feeling the weight of the air around him shift, heavier with meaning, lighter with release. Whatever you believe about justice, about fear, about the way people should be judged, I just ask you this. Look longer. Listen deeper. Ask better questions. Because every time we assume, every time we rush to decide who someone is, we're not just risking a mistake. We're erasing someone's life before they've had the chance to live it. There was no applause. No sweeping music. Just wind brushing through the city, light reflecting off windows, and the sound of footsteps moving forward, David's own, steady and unhurried. Because the true verdict wasn't just in the courtroom. It was in what came after. In the way he walked back into the world, not seeking vengeance, but daring it to be better. And in the echo of his story, raw, imperfect, human, a quiet truth lingered. Justice is not always loud. Sometimes it is a whisper that survives.